I want to look at the rail tool now, and it defaults to a bi-rail mode. But I'll start by using it in its monorail mode with just one rail. So it starts by asking for a generation curve. And then it takes that and sweeps it around a rail curve. So I get the wheel arch rim. And you notice that the generation shape stays at the same angle to the curve as it rolls around. And this is the natural sweep mode. If I switch to parallel, then the generation curve stays in the same orientation as it slides around the rail. So in this case, natural will be what I want. And this is actually the simplest way to build this surface, because we've got the minimum number of CVs to define the shape. And I can control the profile just by modifying the generation curve. So it's an alternative to the skin tool. And another place where we could use rail instead of skin would be along this roof rail. So you could just sweep these profile curves along the edge of the windscreen to create a nice parallel surface. But if I go back into history using Query Edit, I can also control the profile as it sweeps along the rail by scaling it. So 0.8 for example to gently narrow it, or maybe a bit more. And we also have the ability to rotate, but we don't tend to use that as much. So I can do a next, and I need to put my scaling back to 1, and you need to keep an eye on that. And I can just carry on creating parallel sweeps. And this mimics the sort of sweeps that a clay modeler might make on a physical model. So I'll just turn those examples off, because now I want to use the monorail to create the hood and the front surfaces of the car. Now with monorail you typically have the generation curve as the shorter curve and the rail as the longer one. So I'll start by using this centre curve as the generation and the base of the windscreen as the rail. And here's one situation where the natural mode's not really what we want, and parallel gives us a better result. Now you notice that my generation rail curves aren't touching. But I have a choice in the control window to say whether the generation curve is the one to line up with, or whether to fix the rail curve instead. So I'll just keep that gap. And the choice of generation and rail curves affects the direction that the scaling works in. So if I try that now, it always scales in the rail direction. So I could delete that and instead do it the other way round. And I need to switch which is the fixed curve. And then the scaling works from the windscreen out to the front of the car. And I can use this to gently shape the surface, as I don't actually have any direct control over these outer edges. Now whenever I build just one half, I need to check that the mirrored half is smooth. And that's looking good, because I built from the windscreen surface which was already lined up across the centre line. But one thing that I'm not happy with is that the front edge drops down. So I could correct that by turning on the CVs for the surface and direct modelling. But if I want to keep construction history, then I'm going to need an extra curve to specify that. So I'm just going to use Curve Duplicate to borrow a curve from this edge, and then delete the surface. And then I can just flatten this curve by moving the last CV vertically and point snapping in the 2D view. So that then gives me another input for creating the surface. So back in the monorail window, I can now choose to have two generation curves. So I can pick the bottom of the windscreen, and bend my new curve, and keep the centre line as the rail. And you notice that it still copes with the fact that the generation curve doesn't touch the rail. So I'm now controlling that front edge by the shape of the curve, not by the scale slider in the control window, which is more typical of how we'll work. So now I can do a single generation sweep again, and I need to be careful to put the scaling value back to 1 when I don't need it. And I'm choosing the short curves as the generations and the longer curves as the rails. And now all of my surfaces are being controlled just by that one curve. So they stay consistent and parallel as I modify the design. But if I wanted something different, let's say that I wanted the hood to be more curved, but the bumper to stay flatter. Then to get more control, I need more curves. So again, I'll just duplicate this edge to get a starter curve, and then delete the surfaces. And put whatever shape I want to into the curve. And I've got a choice here to say either have 2 generation curves and 1 rail, which looks okay, or because the curves are touching, I could use a birail and instead have 1 generation curve and 2 rails. And I'd typically choose it that way round because the rails are normally the longer curves. And so finally I can just do a couple of monorails to finish off. So now I've got 2 curves controlling the shape. The lower one controlling the bumper, and then this one controlling the shape of the hood. And what I don't have is much control of this outer edge, so that's what I'll cover in the next tutorial. So the rail tool can be used with different combinations of boundary curves, and it's normally the longer ones that are chosen as the rails. And whereas the monorail surface tolerates the curves not being exactly touching, the birail version needs to have all the boundaries accurately connected to the corners. And we'll look at that more in the next tutorial.